we want to give you information, make it easy for you to select the right tree for the right location in order to, yikes, avoid this. I don't know about you, but when I see things like this when I'm driving around, it kind of hurts my heart a little bit. But, you know, utility lines are a consideration for how we plant trees. And you can see on the lower right, this tree's probably spent the last decade trying to make sense of where to put its roots with the hardscaping. So I just adore trees, and I think they're amazing. Research has shown how trees communicate with other trees above ground. Below ground, tree roots, soil microbes, and a vast fungal network interact to exchange sugars, minerals, nutrients, and water. Now, the oldest living tree stands, they estimate to be between 5,000 and 80,000 years old. So estimates on this quaking aspen grove in Utah might be older than 80,000 years. It's a clonal grove, meaning they share the same root system. And just think of what these oldest trees, the history they've seen, the stories that they can tell, and what they've survived. So jumping right in, trees provide enormous benefits to us, to our neighborhoods, to the planet. And here's just a few of these. To our naked eye, trees provide shade, animal and bird habitat, nectar for pollinators, falling leaves and needles that are natural compost underneath the trees that help replenish the soil, wood for our homes, furniture, also beauty in the landscape, windbreaks, noise reduction, so much more. Trees absorb rain. They can help to control erosion by reducing runoff. They block the sun. They make things cool on the ground underneath. And through a process called transpo-evaporation, they release through the surface of their leaves by the water that they've taken up from the ground, and they cool the surrounding air. They provide both recreational and real property value to our homes. Got to be careful where you click here. So not seen by the naked eye, trees absorb and store carbon dioxide. They sequester carbon and they release oxygen. They help clean the air by taking in air pollutants, and that's not all. Studies have shown us that by just looking at trees, it creates positive emotions. And so when I reflect back over this last year, I really got a lot of benefits from gardening, sitting, and walking in nature. And I'm wondering if it also provided you some restorative benefits too, and a stress release. Just being out and sitting under trees and being in nature. Without that this past year would have been a lot harder. So for whatever reason you're deciding to plant a tree, there's a number of key considerations. So before rushing out to your local nursery and making your selection, it helps to be prepared with a little research. So first things first, which is why it's important to know your purpose for wanting to plant a tree. Now, for my own personal story, over the past 3 decades, about every 3 years, my family planted a holiday tree. And those that have lived and survived are huge and very expensive and difficult to maintain. A few that didn't, well, I didn't take a hint in the name, but I just love the gorgeous specimens of Colorado blue spruce. Just not the right zone for them, just not cold enough and too hot. So we're going to give you some easy to use resources to make your selections a little easier. So knowing some key tree characteristics and how they grow will help you understand what trees need to survive and thrive and ensure your satisfaction. Because there's certainly more to a tree than the trunk, the upper canopy and the leaves, and the root structure below. So there's not an actual biological definition for a tree, which is interesting, but for our purposes, a tree is a single-stemmed, self-supporting woody plant. Now, this is not a strict definition because with all things with exceptions, shrubs can be trained as a tree and trees can be grown having multi-stems. But trees and shrubs do share many, many characteristics. Trees typically live longer than other plants, have permanently woody stems and trunks, as opposed to herbaceous stems, which typically but don't always die back to the ground, and those are your annuals, your veggies. They may be trained as multi-stemmed, but they usually have a single central leader with lateral branches at some distance from the ground. Now, a central leader is a dominant upright branch. Trees can grow to a considerable height. There's not one absolute standard of height, but it's often used in the industry. Its tall height is 4 to 5+ meters. Shrubs are typically, but not always, shorter, most commonly with multi-trunk stems of smaller diameter. So you can see here that we have deciduous, evergreen, conifers, broadleaf. The importance between all these categories is knowing if you're more interested in having a tree keep its foliage and remain green year-round, or lose its leaves over the cool months. And there's just a whole lot of advantages to either one. It's your choice. So both trees and shrubs can be deciduous or evergreen. Although evergreens are most commonly conifers like spruce, pine, cedar, and fir, they also include many broadleaf trees like live oaks and magnolias. So as you can see on the right, we have two trees, the arbutus and the broadleaf magnolia, and these remain green with foliage year-round. And you can see small little scale-like leaves on the arbutus here. Evergreens typically have needles or these scale-like leaves, and the seeds are borne in woody cones. But here, the two broadleaf leaves also provide, as do all the evergreens, the pines, the firs, the spruces, and the cedars, a fair amount of litter. And just because they have foliage means that you're still going to have quite a bit of shed during the year. Just think of a forest floor full of evergreens. So many broadleaf trees are deciduous and most often shed their leaves in the fall, but there's exceptions here too. So on the right is that really gorgeous bald cypress. It too sheds its leaves in the fall. Broadleaf tree leaves, like this one in the picture here, are generally flat, and seeds are produced inside fruit. For many broadleaf trees, the changing color of foliage can provide so much stunning color in your landscape. So in California, we have less of that, but there's certainly enough trees that change color and provide that visual interest. So understanding a little bit about tree biology will help in your careful selection of a tree. So primary growth in all plants accounts for how plants grow taller and wider in their spread. In other words, reach and height. So what happens here? There's an increase in the length of roots. There's an increase in height and length from the root tips, not at the base of the trunk, but out of the top, what's called the apical meristem. Now, because of this growth pattern, a low-hanging branch within reach will always remain at the same height from the ground, even though the tree is growing taller. Now, I had my favorite tree when I was a child, and I was able to reach up, and it'd be fun to go back and see if that tree in that lower branch has survived all the development. And leaf production is also considered primary growth. So secondary growth is only in woody plants and does not occur again in the vegetables and annuals, so herbaceous plants. And it's responsible for increasing the diameter of the tree, the stems, the roots, the branches. In other words, it's the girth. So in this cross section, you can see the outer bark is the tree's armor. The area between the thin inner bark to the center of the tree is called a heartwood, which gives the tree its strength. And you can see the appearance of growth rings there. I don't know if you've ever had to count growth rings, taking children on a field trip, and it's fun to watch them try. But in temperate climates, the inner layer does not grow during the winter, and the dark greens visible here indicate where the growth slowed down over the winter. Now, this next bit of information is important in understanding why trees possess a very delicate thin inner layer behind the strong armor. It's a vibrant growth system, and we need to discuss why protecting that from damage keeps the tree from being compromised, and too much damage to that inner layer can actually kill the tree. So if you peel the bark back, and we're really not suggesting you do that, but you can see the cambium, which is C in this, it's only amazingly 1 cell thick. And every year that cambium creates new wood, expanding the diameter of the tree by producing new cells. So this inter-network transport system transports nutrients from the roots to the top of the tree, and from the leaves, and from the sap and the sugar from the leaves out to the rest of the tree. So now we're going to talk a little bit about tree functionality and sizes and shapes and the things that perhaps you need to consider about your tree. So are you wanting a tree for the reason of aesthetics? Shade, perhaps? Fall color? A screen? Or maybe you're interested in fruit and nut production, the color of leaves, nuts, and berries, a privacy screen, or to block an unsightly view or screen as a windbreak. Provide shade, cool comfort, conserve energy, reduce erosion from water runoff if you have a hillside, enhancing the environment for wildlife by providing food and shelter, increase your property value, or the advantages of getting a deciduous versus an evergreen tree in the spot you've got picked out. Now, in terms of shape and form, this chart shows that there's various names for some of these that you'll find. And they're pretty common, but they're not always the same across different tree charts when you look for the research. But you need to consider shape and form. And the reasons that is important is it's easier to manage a tree and its natural shape and form than it is to try and correct it later with intensive and really expensive solutions. So just think of that first slide of the mutilated tree and the amount of time and effort it takes for the utility companies to maintain their lines. Trees can be left looking unnaturally deformed in shape. There are, however, really pleasing and desired forms that do require more maintenance. So if space saving is a consideration for you, there's a technique for an espalier tree, and that's used for training branches to grow laterally, like in many fruit trees that you see tethered to a fence line. And again, that's an espalier tree. Just an interesting option to think about. So these next two slides are going to give you some idea of what mature trees are like in the landscape. So these may not have reached their maximum height or their maximum canopy spread. So you have to keep those considerations in mind too. So in the top right, we have two weeping trees. On the bottom left, you see the pyramidal shape, and next to that, a bare tree in a vase shape, and two more open vase-shaped trees that are on the right. Again, different open tree structures. And here are more ideas of mature trees in the landscape. On the top, you have an umbrella form. On the right, a column-like line of trees. Next to that, a more open structure tree. Next to that, a round tree. And next to that one, an oval, taller tree. So shape and form can also be influenced by consistent, strong winds that you might have to keep in mind for your area and the amount of sunlight. Selecting a shape when mature fits your location is going to save you decades of fighting a form that simply doesn't work. So I challenge you as you're driving around next time to really count the different forms and shapes and sizes of trees as you're driving around to see what you find that's pleasing. So mature tree size is a really big consideration. So you need to choose a tree that's not going to outgrow the planting space available. So the size of a mature tree is at maximum height in optimal conditions may take decades. Something to keep in mind. So canopy spreads, also known as the drip line, another consideration. That's how far the tree naturally spreads those upper branches. The canopy spread and drip line are really good terms to know and understand for shade and the competition of potentially other nearby plants that you have that are growing in the area. Root spread. Now there's a really misconception about how the majority of the feeder roots are concentrated within the drip line, but they're not. And as you can see here, they extend about 4 to 7 times the spread of that drip line of the tree. This might impact your underground utility lines, hardscaping, and importantly, and really important, how you choose to irrigate your growing and your expanding tree. So I have a question for you. is the tree that you're thinking of planting, is it for posterity or does it fulfill a more immediate need? Because not every source is going to give you the same definition for a tree's height as small, medium, or tall, or as fast-growing, moderate, or slow growth. However, if you're looking ahead a decade, rule of thumb, there's a sort of average of what defines the growth rate over 10 years. Slow is being less than 14 feet, moderate of 14 to 24 feet, and fast is 24 plus feet. So we've kind of given a good bit of consideration about what we're wanting from a tree in the landscape. But what does a tree need? Choosing a tree suited to the site is the key to your long-lived, healthy, happy you and tree. We can't stress that enough. Right tree, right location. It's easier and more effective than completely altering your site to fit the tree if it's not suited for your zone because of heat or frost. I found that out with my Colorado blue spruce. And fruit trees require their own consideration for the number of chill hours, which is consecutive hours of temperatures between 32 and 45 degrees. This will vary widely about fruit tree variety. So the climate in Contra Costa County is we have hot, dry summers, and the winters are generally really mild. Well, trees can tolerate infrequent summer watering after establishment, and some trees can't. So you need to think about choosing trees that, if they're not planted in a lawn area, they're favored for more of a drought-tolerant tree because of our climate. The climate zones and hardiness zones found in much of Contra Costa, or the USDA hardiness zone, is 9B and 10A. The sunset climate zones is 14 through 17, and then the different chill hours by your tree. So to consult your specific zones, we'll share the resource for the sunset climate zone and the USDA hardiness zones. But just take note that a USDA hardiness zone of 10 is not the same thing as a sunset climate zone of 10. So questions for your site analysis too is a checklist. So if you have high winds and they're common in your area, does your selection tolerate this? Sun, shade, each species has a minimum number of sun and shade hours that it needs every day. Drainage is a key consideration, as is your soil type. What about water availability? How close is it? How do you plan to water the trees and irrigate? What about proximity to utilities or hardscaping, fencing? Fire risk. Unfortunately, we have to keep this in mind. And pest resistant. If you have a specific tree in mind, it might have a known common pest and disease in the area, something for you to consider and look into, because there's various rootstocks you can buy that are resistant to some of these pests. So we're quickly going to run through only one slide about soil because it's such a huge topic of soil science. But looking at this illustration, just to kind of boil it down, the pore space in sandy soils, as you can see, there's a lot of aeration room by the color, the yellow that you see. So nutrients, water, minerals, tree roots, air, all of that can circulate a little more freely than it can when you look at clay soils that are more tightly compacted, which are here on the right. So when it rains, you can see what water does in more sandy soils as it disappears and filters down. And perhaps on clay soils, you might see it pool, which is very important for understanding what your roots are going to have in terms of water, air, nutrient uptake in the soil. So knowing your textures, is sandy, loamy, or clay? Tree species have different tolerances for acidity, alkalinity, nutrient deficiencies, and heavy soil with poor drainage. We're going to share the NRCS Web Soil Survey, which again is a very easy way to access what your soil is in your specific area. You can take a soil sample to a lab and get an analysis, or you can buy yourself a small in-home soil testing kit from your local hardware store or your local nursery, not as sophisticated. And I do want to mention one thing here about hardpan, because it's something that's very prominent in Contra Costa County, and particularly in the inland areas. And I have a full acre of hardpan underneath all my fruit trees. So I only have 8 to 10 inches of topsoil. And what a hard pan is it's a compacted layer of soil that roots can't penetrate. Same with water. It's just a very difficult kind of soil to manage. But Sheila's going to share with you an idea about how to plant your tree if that's your case. So fire smart. We have to be very, very smart about fire because of what's going on in Contra Costa County. And it's unfortunate that wildfire zones really surround so many of our areas. But there's a new science out there called Defensible Space. It's defined as vegetation management practice, and it's aimed at reducing wildfire threat to homes. And it helps firefighters to have both a non-flammable roof and not have overhanging branches and other defensible space around the house in order to slow the flames, lengthen the short of flames, and to reduce the amount of heat. So PG&E has listed the trees that caused 75% of the problems on their grid this last year. 5 different varieties of oak, 3 different varieties of pine, the 2 eucalyptus, and the Douglas fir as trees to avoid for planting. Now, El Cerrito's added 2 trees to their list. Both the coast redwood and the Monterey cypress is not to plant in the landscape. But no tree is entirely fire resistant. So as you can see here, we've got some examples. But when we look up resources for fire resistant trees, there's not a complete agreement because, again, the science is rather new. So trees that are less flammable, generally speaking, are typically deciduous with smooth trunks, as these trees retain more water in their leaves. Fire-resistant trees also have bigger, fleshier leaves. Of course, fire-safe practices must also be followed with any tree by removing all the dead debris branches that are within the tree and removing an accumulation of debris that are under trees. We've included some excellent resources for you on fire-safe landscaping. And I'm already presupposing a question about should we rake the bottom of underneath our trees when you talk about what good compost that makes. Well, we always have to balance out what we do as gardeners. So we have a lot of online resources. Again, we're going to share these. And also included here is the one for Sonoma County on their Firewise Landscaping. When you go to this website, which we're going to share with you, you can get videos, PDFs, because Sonoma County suffered so badly in the last 2 years of wildfires. They put out these excellent resources for homeowners to use in landscaping. But we're going to focus just briefly on the Cal Poly Select Tree site from San Luis Obispo. So this is a screenshot of select criteria. And if you know the key characteristics, you can generate a list of so many different trees. However, I found out if you select too many criteria, the results may show you few, if no trees at all. So start with the basic and most desired characteristics and go from there. You also, if you know the name of the specific tree you're looking for by its common name or its botanical name, you can also put that into a field, and that will generate quite a robust tree description for all the tree characteristics for that specific tree, and it'll tell you what the growing conditions are. So here's an example. Let's just say that we've got a spot picked out to block a neighbor's old shed. Now, I've selected 5 characteristics here that are most important to narrowing down my search. I'm interested in the maximum height, the growth rate, the foliage, and my 2 zones. We want it to grow fast, but not taller than 20 feet. And we want something that's evergreen in zone 14. I was able to generate a list of 33 possibilities that I could select from. And then when I studied the list, I was able to narrow it down to those that produced less litter, but yet had a lot of color in the landscape, which I was very interested in. So there's lots and lots of ways to research and select your trees, and we tried to give you enough resources to make that an easier selection process for you.
All right, well, good evening, everyone. You've just heard from Denece about the very many benefits of having trees in your landscape. And Denece also discussed how you can choose the right tree species that's good for your location and which fits your needs. Now we will look at how to select the tree in the nursery, how to plant it, and what care the newly planted tree will need. There are a number of good nurseries in our area, but be aware that a nursery may not have your first choice in stock. It helps to call around first, and if they don't have the tree that you want, they can often order it for you. But sometimes that tree may not even be available from the growers, so you may want to have an alternative tree in mind just in case your first choice is not available. Choosing a high quality specimen is important for the future health and longevity of your tree. And so when making your selection, here are a few things to look for. Okay. Now, when you're in the nursery looking at the trees, don't pick one just because it's the largest one there. Research has shown that a smaller tree establishes more quickly, and within 2 to 3 years, it probably will have caught up with a larger tree that was planted at the same time. Now, you're not likely to find the perfect plant, but here are a few attributes of a good selection. The tree should have a strong trunk with the topmost branch growing vertically out of the top of the trunk. And this is the central leader that Denece mentioned earlier. Earlier, you heard that growth occurs from the shoot tips, and the tip of the central leader is responsible for increase in height of the tree. And this central leader needs to be the tallest branch, because if other branches compete by becoming longer, higher or thicker, then the growth pattern of the tree will be distorted. And we'll talk about how to promote this good structure shortly. Look for any damage on the trunk or the branches, such as injuries or diseased areas. Now, ideally, the trunk will be wider at the base than the top. This is known as the trunk taper, and this makes for a stronger structure in the tree. Shake the trunk gently. It shouldn't move independently of the root ball. Now, these numbers over here show the ideal trunk diameter in relation to the size of the pot. But this is one factor in assessing the health of the tree, and these numbers will be included in our references. Now, this slide shows an image of a young tree with ideal structure. The branches are spaced evenly around the trunk and attached at about a 45-degree angle. Now, what's most important is that the foliage should look healthy with no dead or badly broken branches. And as for the structure, it's good to look ahead now and plan for how you want the tree to look in future years. Now, some of these branches will probably be removed during the training process, and some may become permanent. Will you want branches low down on the trunk to create a screen? Or will the lowest permanent branch need to be high enough to allow traffic underneath, vehicles or people to pass underneath? Actually, a young tree may not yet be tall enough to have branches that will be permanent, and these will grow out as the tree grows in height. But for now, most of these lower branches will be retained as part of the training process. Now to check the roots. The quality of the roots is very important because for long-term health, the tree needs to establish a good network of roots spreading out from the trunk. And you may remember that earlier slide, which shows those roots going way out beyond the drip line. And we need to allow this to develop in the tree. Check the soil level at the top of the pot. Up here, you should be able to see the bottom of the trunk, just where the roots emerge. Now, sometimes a tree may have been planted too deeply in the pot, and this could lead to problems later on, so it's important to check the top. Ask the nursery person if the tree can be removed from the pot so that you can check the roots. It shouldn't come out so easily that the soil falls away from a root ball that may be too small. And if it's very hard to pull out of the pot, this could indicate a root-bound plant. Now, in this slide, the tree on the left has some obvious large circling roots. Large roots that circle around or point in a direction other than out, and this one looks like it might be going up, they will never grow out straight, but will continue to grow in the direction that they're pointing in now. And roots that continue to circle may actually girdle the other roots and impact the growth of the whole root system. So this tree would probably not be the best choice. And if you look over on this side, the tree on the right, you can't see any large circling roots, but you see some nice white healthy ones up here. And there's some smaller circling ones here, which probably don't matter, because when you plant this tree, you can loosen up this part of the roots and spread them out. So this tree is probably a better choice. But a less than perfect root ball can be pruned and loosened up at planting. But a tree with serious root defects will probably never grow well. So now you've brought your new tree home and you are ready to dig the hole. You should have all the needed equipment ready, that is a shovel, nearby water, and a knife to cut the ties off the nursery stake. You want shears and clippers in case you need to prune the roots. And if the tree looks like it needs staking, have 2 stakes and some ties ready. It's also very nice to have a helper, especially if the tree is 15-gallon or larger. And I suggest watering the container ahead of time, so the soil will be moist, because the root ball may be dry. And even if you think you've watered the tree, sometimes that root ball can still be dry, so make sure it's moist. Now for preparing the site, the planting hole needs to be dug so that the final height of the root crown ends up about 1 to 2 inches above the soil level, and it leaves plenty of room for the roots to spread out. Now the root crown is the area at the bottom of the trunk, just where the roots begin to grow out. And this area needs to be kept clear of soil or mulch or any other material, because if it's covered or stays wet, then there may be eventually problems with decay in this area. So you dig a hole about twice as wide as the width of the root ball, and just deep enough so that the bottom of the trunk is at the correct level just above the grade here. Don't dig it any deeper, because the soil may settle and the root ball will sink. So you leave a small cone or mound of undug soil in the center, or you can build one and tamp it down, but you want a firm base for this root ball. Which helps prevent sinking, and it also can help with the height adjustment. Once you get the tree out of the pot, you can put the root ball here and check the level. If you have poor drainage due to the hard pan that Denece mentioned earlier, I can't go into real details about how to deal with this, but there was a link on that slide which gives a lot more details, and that'll be in our references. But basically, you'll want to bore some holes down through the bottom of the planting hole here, which goes through the hard pan layer. But you'll read more details about this in the references. But yeah, if your soil happens to be sandy, then you can plant the tree with the root ball, with the crown at grade level, because sandy soil doesn't tend to sink and the soil drains well. Finally, roughen the sides of the hole with a shovel or a knife. And this helps to, when you're blending in the backfill soil, it helps to blend it in with the surrounding soil, which makes it easier for the roots to penetrate out into the surrounding soil. And it also helps a bit with drainage. Now remove the tree from the pot. If the tree doesn't come out easily, then you can shake it a bit, squeeze the sides and water it. Slide the root ball out carefully and make sure not to damage the trunk while you're doing this, and a helper is useful here. If the roots are tight, pull them apart with your fingers, and you may need to wash off some of the soil in order to do this. At this time, you may also find more roots circling or pointing inwards, as you can see here. You're going to need to prune these and cut away any broken or dead roots, and also prune off any matted fibrous roots, which you can often find at the bottom of the pot. Now here's a cautionary tale. This photo here shows problem roots that probably the tree should have been rejected earlier, but this is my tree. And because of where I got the tree, I didn't feel that I could take it back. So I pruned off all these roots that you see circling around so I could straighten them as well as possible. I did plant the tree. This was about 4 or 5 months ago. So I'm now waiting to see if it A, survives and B, does okay. So we shall see. Now, sometimes, most of the time in the nursery, you'll find a tree that's in a container, but sometimes, especially if the tree is very large, it might come balled and burlapped. And this is where the roots are wrapped around with burlap and there's a wire basket around the outside. Now, the planting process for this tree is the same as for a potted tree. But you're going to need to remove all this wrapping. You have to cut off the wire cage and remove all the burlap, because sometimes the burlap has been treated with a root retardant to stop the roots coming out in the nursery. And you don't want to leave this on when you're planting the tree. So remove all the coverings and plant the tree as before. And especially with a fruit tree, you may have a bare root tree. And this is when the tree is sold when it's winter dormant, with just the bare roots wrapped up in maybe sawdust or something like that. Before planting, you're going to need to take the tree out of the covering and put it in a bucket of water to soak for a few hours, never longer than overnight. But then the planting process is the same as before. The hole's prepared the same, and you plant with the root crown just above the grade, and you spread the roots out over the soil cone. Now, when all is ready, position the tree in the hole, and the helper can hold it here. And put the bottom of the root ball on the cone or mound, and check finally the planting depth. You can adjust at this point by taking soil away from the top of the mound or adding it, just to make sure that this level is right. Spread the roots that you loosened out over the mound. Now, if the tree is grafted, as are most fruit trees and some landscape trees, position it so that the graft union faces away from the sun, that is north. This graft area that you can see here is sensitive to more sensitive to sunburn, so it helps to give it a bit of protection. Now, backfill carefully with the soil that you dug out, but don't add any amendments to the soil. Because roots will be more reluctant to grow out into the surrounding soil if they've got nice, rich soil in the hole. Also, water may not drain quite as well if there's a sharp demarcation between two soil layers. Remove air pockets that will be in the backfill soil. You can tamp it down with the flat of the shovel and water it in, definitely, but don't compact the soil. Build a small berm of soil around the outside of the hole, about 12 to 18 inches away from the trunk. And this helps to create a little water basin and helps prevent irrigation water from running away. Now, the nursery stake must be removed. This stake is usually tied quite firmly to the trunk in the nursery. And they do that to protect the young tree. But in order for the tree to develop strong roots and a trunk, it's very important that it's able to move in the breeze. If the tree can't stand on its own, place 2 stakes deeply into the ground outside the root ball on opposite sides of the tree. And this is especially needed if the tree is in a windy area or on a slope. So what stakes and ties do you use? The stakes shown here are the lodgepole pine ones that are easily found at nurseries. The ties must be soft enough not to damage the trunk. You can purchase ones made of rubber material, or you can improvise. I tend to use strips of torn up cloth. And one tree expert I've heard speak likes to use old nylon pantyhose. But the important thing is that the ties don't damage the trunk and they allow for some movement. Tie the tree to the stakes as low as possible, just at the point where the trunk begins to bend over. And you can find that point by after you've planted it, just hold the trunk at various places along its length. And no, I didn't mean to do that. And just where it stops flopping over, that's where you would put the ties. And if the stakes are too tall, cut away the excess height, because you don't want these stakes to rub against the branches. Now, when you've planted it, water it thoroughly. Make sure that root ball is moist, especially if it had tight roots. And you also want to do some other things to protect the young tree. You can paint the trunk with white water-based paint, diluted 50% with water. Don't use oil-based paint. Now, this is usually done for fruit trees, but maybe not always with landscape trees, because if the landscape trees have branches lower down on the trunk, which sometimes they do, then there's no need to paint it because the low branches will give it some shade. If there's any risk of mechanical damage from mowers, vehicles, animals such as deer, or even people, you can wrap a wire cage around the outside of the stakes. Finally, mulch the surrounding area, but leaving a clear area around the trunk. And you probably know that this mulch layer has many benefits for both tree and soil health. Now, if you have limited space, trees can grow very well in a large container. It's probably better to select a naturally small tree rather than a large variety. But trees such as Japanese maples, olives, sweet bay, and espaliered fruit trees even, and also citrus, can grow very well in a container. And these photos here show how beautiful they can be. A good container should only be a few inches larger all around than the root ball of the plant. And for container trees, drainage is especially important. And the pot should have holes of sufficient size to allow for this. Many containers come with only one hole in the bottom, in the middle, and you may need to drill more holes around to allow for better drainage. Don't add gravel or pot shards below the soil, because contrary to what you might think, this actually impedes the drainage. Because when you have two layers of a different texture, the water in the soil above the gravel will not drain until it's completely saturated. And this phenomenon is known as a perched water table. And it will keep that soil too wet. Use soil specific for containers. A good quality potting soil is okay. This container tree will need more frequent irrigation and fertilizing than a tree in the ground, but don't overdo either of these things. Now, once the tree is planted, it will need some TLC during the first few years. We'll only cover the initial pruning steps now, but we've included a lot more information on pruning in the references. When the tree's first planted, pruning is kept to an absolute minimum, just enough to ensure a good start to the training process. Most of the branches will be kept for now, as they provide the young tree with food and protection. Some of these branches will be removed later on. During the next few years, you will be doing some further pruning, as good structure is very important for the future health and safety of the tree. When landscape trees are trained properly from a young age, they will grow better, stay healthier, and are less likely to need major pruning later in life. And this is important because pruning while the tree is young is very good. Every pruning cut leaves a wound on the tree. Now, trees can't heal wounds in the same way as we do, but rather they seal over a wound. A small cut on a small tree seals well, but the process is much slower for an older tree with a large cut. Now, this leaves the tree vulnerable to attack by pathogens, and it can lead to rotting inside the tree. So you can see why pruning while the tree is young is very good. So for the newly planted tree, pruning is focused on two main issues. First, the 3 Ds. Now, the 3 Ds refer to any branches that are dead, damaged, or diseased. These need to be removed now. And the other thing is to address any serious structural problems. such as more than one central leader. Now, we talked about central leaders before. Identify the vertical branch that is the best central leader and remove or shorten any branches that compete. That is, branches that are longer, taller, or thicker. The leader should be the topmost branch. And you can see, I hope you don't get a tree that looks like this. This is just a diagram, but you can see with this one, there's two contenders for possible central leaders, and one of these is going to need to be removed. You also remove or shorten any branches that cross or rub against each other, like these ones up here that you see. Don't remove the small little twiggy branches that you see on the lower part of the trunk, or they may be there or may not, or any branches other than those that have been mentioned. These are called the nurse branches, which may be temporary, but they're needed right now for food production and protection of the tree. And finally, when you make a pruning cut, don't use anything to seal that cut. I know nurseries still sell those pruning sealers, but you don't want to use anything because research has found that it doesn't help seal the wound, and it actually hinders the tree's own sealing process. Now, here's a summary of the initial pruning items. Establish the clear central leader. And some trees don't need much, if any, initial training. For example, conifers often have a strong central leader, but they may have more than one of these, in which case you prune out the extras. And certainly, if any branches are longer or thicker than the central leader, shorten these. Some trees which have a naturally spreading shape, such as a Chinese pistache, may not have a clear leader, and it can be a little bit harder to decide which is the best, but it's better to establish one if you can. And all other pruning, wait for the next growing season to continue training. And this slide shows some pruning tools that you'll probably need in the future, if not now. The hand pruners are good for small branches. And if you've got any slightly bigger ones, then the loppers can make a better cut. You probably won't need the saw right now, but these small folding pruning saws are extremely useful. And now some basic information on how to make pruning cuts. This diagram shows how a branch is attached to the trunk or to another larger branch. Now remember that trees have to deal with wounds by sealing them off. And the branch collar shown on the slide here contains the tissue that is needed for wound sealing. And so we don't want to remove this area. And the branch bark ridge is also part of this structure. The pruning cuts are made just outside this area. Don't cut it flush with the trunk because you're going to take off all this good stuff here. But you don't want to leave a stub either. So just outside the branch collar is the right place to cut. There are several different kinds of pruning cut that we use. The thinning cut, which is what is used most often, is the one that's shown here. There's also reduction thinning, which is to cut the branch back to a smaller branch that's at least a third of its diameter. Now, the smaller branch that you cut back to needs to be this size because you need a branch that's big enough that's going to take over the lengthening function that the original branch had. And you remember that the branch grows from its tip. So this is why that if you do a reduction thinning, it has to be back to no smaller than a third of the diameter of the branch. Now, the other type of cut is called a heading cut. And this is where a branch is just cut somewhere along the length. This kind of cut you may use when you're training a young tree if you're shortening a temporary branch that will be later removed. Then you would cut back to a smaller lateral, or an outward-facing bud. This is only used occasionally, probably mainly in training the young trees. Do you want to avoid this in an older tree with big branches? Because here you can see how the tree responds to heading cuts by bushy regrowth of branches that are weakly attached to their branch of origin. It's especially important not to head off the top of the tree, and this is called topping the tree. This will not ultimately keep a large tree small, but it prevents the tree from growing to its natural form. It causes weak regrowth because all this bushy stuff is attached. The attachment is much weaker than for the main branches. And it leaves large pruning wounds here. So they're open to possible decay from the large wounds and branches that may break later on from this weak attachment. Now, the link shown here is for a UC video. This video shows you how to train a young tree over the next few years. And I highly recommend you watch this. It's only about 15 minutes, but it's very, very good. It gives you great detail about how you train a young tree. Now, pruning for fruit trees is somewhat different because unlike landscape trees, pruning techniques can keep these trees small. And trees are also pruned, the pruning is directed to encourage the best fruit production. And unfortunately, we don't have time to go into this now, but you can find information on pruning fruit trees in the references. Now, apart from pruning, there are some other things to consider in caring for your young tree. You need to check the stakes and the ties occasionally for girdling. You don't want either stakes or ties to damage the trunk. And leave the stakes on for the shortest possible time, certainly no longer than a year. And if the tree can stand on its own sooner than that, remove the stakes sooner. Young trees will need regular water for the first few years. Even if the tree is supposed to be a drought-tolerant variety, a young tree will need that water. Soil shouldn't dry out, but shouldn't become waterlogged. So how much water do you give the tree and how often? Well, the master gardener favourite response, it depends. It depends on the season. It'll need less water if the tree is dormant. But if the winter is dry, it might need some irrigation during the winter. It's going to need more in hot weather. But ultimately, let soil moisture be your guide. If you're not sure, then check around the root zone with a trowel or a soil probe. And generally, we water again when the top few inches of soil is dry. But if you check a little bit down in the root zone, you can tell what the soil moisture is like. When you irrigate, apply the water slowly, so that it can penetrate deeply and over the whole root zone. And as the tree grows, you're going to need to move this irrigation further out. If you use drip irrigation, the drip lines will need to be moved further out. Don't just leave one dripper right at the trunk. And you're going to need to add more drippers or more drip lines as well. Remember the berm and the watering basin that you made at planting time. Well, this will need to be removed after about the first year, as the roots will outgrow the size of the well, and the water should be applied more widely to encourage root expansion. Landscape trees generally don't need fertilizer unless a soil test indicates a need for fertilizing. The soil around the root area should be kept free of weeds and other vegetation, including lawns. This is to reduce competition for water and nutrients. And the mulch that you added at planting time will help with this. Now, this picture here shows a young tree with too many weeds growing around. So these weeds should be cleared and the area mulched. Plan to keep the lawn away from the trunk even as the tree grows, because this will help keep the crown area dry, and it'll reduce likelihood of somebody whacking it with a mower. If the tree is planted in or near a lawn, it should be on a separate irrigation schedule from that of the lawn, because irrigation needs of the tree and the lawn are different. The tree wants to be irrigated probably less frequently and more deeply than the lawn. Now, taking good care of your tree is the best possible preventive measure for reducing future problems. But if you should see pest or disease problems, UC uses an integrated pest management approach. And this involves accurate identification of the pest or disease and managing it using effective methods that are least harmful to people and the environment and to the tree. And these include biological control, cultural, mechanical or physical, and with chemical control like pesticides, recommended only when necessary, when no other method is effective. And we've given a link here to the very extensive UC website that you can use to search for more information on your trees and their possible problems. And you can also find information on other aspects of gardening. Now, this has been a very brief introduction to the wonderful world of trees, and I hope it's encouraged you to start planting. Now, please delve into the reference materials that we will send out. And if you have further questions, our Master Gardener Help Desk will be glad to assist you.